All right. Good morning, everyone. Yesterday we went over Docker and how Docker files work. We didn't really cover too much about the naming convention, but we did talk about how to create a Docker file, how that Docker file can be built into a Docker image, and how that Docker image can be ran into a Docker container. Well, today we're going to talk about Django, how we can build a Docker file that will run a Django instance or a Django container eventually. Hard pull away from the project. Oh, no problem. And then we're also going to talk about how we can link each individual Docker container. So by the end of this, we'll have a Docker container running Django and a separate container running Postgres. They'll have to link on into each other so that we can actually make our migrations and set our data into our Postgres database. So let's get into Docker real quick. Before we even start with anything here, all we're going to do is we're going to create a new Python project. So I already have a virtual environment built out inside of this folder named environments. So I'm just going to activate it. And then this way I can go ahead and start a new Django project. Okay, so my Django API has been built out. We can see I have a folder here that has my settings.py, my WSGI, a couple of other things. We have manage.py, and we have this Dockerfile. Well, this Dockerfile is still referencing Postgres. And eventually I want to create another Dockerfile that will reference we will actually need to create another Dockerfile that will reference Django itself. But we can't have two Docker files that have the same exact name inside of the same directory. So we can change the name by simply saying dockerfile.postgres. And then we can create another file. So touch dockerfile.django. Actually, I'm just going to call it API because it's going to be running the API. Okay, so now I have this new Docker file that I can work with to be able to actually run Django. And I have this one that's already been separated, and it's running Postgres. All right, so utilizing what we learned yesterday, we can kind of have a general idea of what we want, how this would end up looking like whenever we go to build this project. So the first one is from. I can see that the Docker file with Postgres says from Postgres : latest. So what do you guys think would go on the first line of the Docker file for the API?
From Django latest.
Yeah, that's a good approach. And Django used to have an official Docker image, but unfortunately it went away. So now we have to utilize from Python latest. Right, because this is essentially going to be running Python. There's a couple of different things that we can do here. If we had separate directories, which we will eventually, we can specify which directory all of these files are supposed to be running into. But for the time being, since we only have one root directory that's holding all of our information, we don't need to add a work directory path. But now we need to actually update all of our information. Now, whenever a container is actually running, I'm sure you all noticed, it actually starts an Ubuntu instance. So when it starts that Ubuntu instance, we know that in Ubuntu, what we utilize is apt-get to be able to install anything. So we need to say apt-get update, and that's just going to update our installer. And the next thing is we're going to install a couple of dependencies that we need to be able to talk to PsychoPG. Sorry, not PsychoPG, to be able to talk to Postgres. So we're going to say apt-get install -y -no install -recommends. Okay, so this portion is just going to tell Python, hey, I want you to install exactly what I'm telling you to install. But I'm sure that you guys have seen sometimes when you install a Python package or you go to install something through pip, it tells you, hey, we're not only gonna install PG, but we're also going to install this like SQL parse and all of these other things that come along with it. Well, we don't necessarily ever use those, and we may not even need them. So by giving it no install recommended, we're saying, hey, I only want exactly what I'm telling you and none of the recommended installments to come along with it. All right, GCC. And then the final thing is the Postgres client. Nope. Let me actually take a look here at what GCC is actually doing. I don't think I have a breakdown for the GCC command. I may have to look that one up. All right. Now, the next thing that we have is we actually want to be able to grab all of our dependencies from our Python project. So currently I have this Django API, I have this virtual environment, but what's missing in here? Before I push it up to GitHub where I give this project to another developer, what should be inside of my directory whenever I'm working on a backend project?
Requirement text.
Yeah, I need a requirements.txt, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pip freeze requirements.txt. This is just all of my dependencies are inside of the same directory, all right? And now I need to tell Docker, hey, I want you to grab this information. Now, remember, if Docker is just an image, it doesn't actually have any files inside of it, regardless of what root directory it's on. It doesn't have anything in it unless I tell it to grab something. So in this case, I'm going to tell it, I want you to copy requirements.txt. So it's going to grab this file and copy it into the image itself. And then I need to specify the path as to where it can find it. And in this case, since it's inside the same directory, I just need to put a dot. Like, hey, I need you to copy the requirements.txt, and you can find it here inside of this directory. Any questions over these couple of commands that we've covered so far?
I'm sorry, that command essentially copies the requirements.txt onto itself.
Not onto itself, but it copies the requirements.txt into the image. All right, so the Docker image is going to build, and we can build an entire Docker image without any files inside of it. If we want any files to be included inside of that Docker image, so that when we run the container, we can actually have a functioning project, we need to actually copy this information. So right now we're only copying requirements.txt, but eventually we'll want to copy the entire directory.
Oh, okay. I think I'm understanding.
You go over the lines again, just line by line, exactly what's going on.
Yeah, of course. So the first thing we're doing here on line 1, we're grabbing Python and we're grabbing the latest version of Python. And then we know that by saying Python, I can go on Docker Hub. I could click on their Python image and I can see the different versions that they have, right? So that's where latest is coming from. Now, when I know I'm running an Ubuntu instance and I'm going to be using this apt-get installer. So before I start installing anything, I always update. It's kind of like upgrading your pip, right? Well, in this case, I want to update my installer to make sure I have the latest version. So I'm updating apt-get. And then after that, I'm going to start installing a couple of dependencies. But I'm setting a default value here saying, hey, whenever I install something, I want you to give, if at any point it asks me a question like, do you really want to download this? And it's like, yes or no. The default answer will be yes. And that's what I mean by -y, right? And then after that, I'm saying, but I don't want you to install any of the recommended packages. I only want you to install exactly what I have here, right? So that's what this portion means. I'm not quite sure what GCC means. I apologize. I'll have to look that one up. But the next thing that we install is the Postgres client, and this is just going to allow us to have a Python Python container that can talk to Postgres back and forth, right? Which is what we're going to need without including, and that's so. Postgres client is different from PG. So don't think that by installing Postgres client, you won't need psychopg. All right, this is specifically pertaining to the containers. And then after that, we're just copying requirements txt. Oh, thank you, Jake. I appreciate that description. Did that answer your question, Roger?
Yeah, those backward slashes, is that kind of like just commas?
So remember how we have like /n whenever you're writing a string and you're saying, hey, this is a separate command? That's what this slash.
Okay. Pretty much that's all. Except those files, are they all in the same directory under Docker lessons? Or is there anything there that's
Yep, everything's under Docker lessons.
Okay.
All right. So now I copied over my requirements txt. And now the next thing I could do, well, I would want to install over my requirements, but just like we said before, right? Anytime I'm using some sort of installer, I want to update it first. So now we're talking about requirements txt. So what would I need to update in this case? What Python installer do we utilize to install our requirements?
Pip install.
Yeah, pip, right? So I would want to update pip. So I'm going to utilize, which command would I use? Would I use, yeah, which one of these commands that we've seen so far would I end up using here?
run? But didn't you say you were doing that at an app-get update?
Yeah, so remember apt-get is referencing to like Django, right? Or actually not even Django. Well, apt-get would be referencing towards Python, Node.js. It would be referencing towards something like Nginx, some of the bigger like frameworks that I'm actually installing, right? Whereas in pip is in reference to more of the smaller picture stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. So then I can say pip install -- upgrade pip. So that upgrades my pip. And then after that, I can just install requirements txt. So pip install -r requirements.txt. Now, we have these as two separate commands, but we could definitely just make it one. I can use double ampersand here. That's just going to say and. And I could place that there. So it's going to say, hey, I want you to install, to basically upgrade pip. And once you're done upgrading pip, I want you to install requirements txt. All right, instead of having so many different run commands over and over again. And I can do the same thing here. I can grab apt-get, bring it down, and then just put the and, the double ampersand. So let's do that. Apt-get and double ampersand. Okay, so now by now we should have all of our dependencies copied over. Now you may think to yourself, well, why do we just copy requirements txt instead of copying the entire project all at once and then running requirements txt? Well, this is more of an isolation process. If anything fails, I want to make sure that I can identify where it failed. If I just copied the entire file over and something was wrong with requirements txt, well, I would never catch that error. Instead, I would get an error saying, hey, something wrong happened around copy. And that's as far as the error would go. So I want to make sure that I isolate this so that I know, hey, requirements txt was able to copy successfully. If there was an error later on, it didn't have to do with my dependencies. So now let's copy the entire file. So now I'm going to say copy this entire directory. And you can find it here in this entire in this directory. All right, that's what that dot means. So copy this entire directory, and you can find it here. Any questions?
So it's gonna, I'm sorry, so it's gonna override the requirements txt? Overwrite?
Oh, technically, yes, because it would then recopy requirements txt. That's correct. I can specify it to where I can tell it which each individual file. But if I already had requirements txt and I installed it, I have no problem with copying and just kind of writing that file all over again.
What about the so the environments, right? You probably said it in the beginning. The environments folder right now is outside of the Docker lessons. Is it you know, can I keep the environment folder in there as well?
Environments folder outside of Docker lessons.
You know, when you activated the environment, it's currently in the environments.venv.
You
Didn't
can,
activate.
yeah, I would recommend not having it. There may be a command that you can utilize to exclude that specific file or directory specific, but you're not going to want your Python virtual environment on here. Think about a container as the same thing as the deployment EC2 instance, right? It's a lot more lightweight, so they're not the same thing. Remember, the EC2 instance is a virtual machine. Dockers are containers, right? But just like you wouldn't want a virtual environment inside of that virtual machine because there's really no purpose to that, right? It's isolated, and we would only want the dependencies in there to be the ones that we need for our project. Well, it's the same thing for the container. So we would never actually start a virtual environment within a container. Does that make sense, Ivan?
It does. Thank you.
Of course. All right, so now the very last thing would be to expose a port so that I can actually see my Django project. And in this case, the port that I want to expose would be 8,000. All right, and now let's go ahead and run a command here. And actually, before let's run this command first. So we're going to say Python. Oh, that's not it. Manage.py. Run server. Okay, so again, what's the difference between run and command? Does anyone remember what the difference is from yesterday's lesson?
I don't think I caught that yesterday.
Yeah, that makes sense. So run commands are going to happen upon build, right? And then the command is going to happen upon run. Once we run the image and create a container, that's when this part will be executed. And run commands will happen whenever we build the image. So right now, let's just actually make our migrations as well. Let's include that in here. So run Python manage.py migrate, since that's all we'll have. Okay. So now technically this should all work and it should be pretty simple. But as far as actually running it, and actually I may be jumping the gun here. Does anyone have any questions over what we've done so far?
So is this setting up, is this set up for an image or is this set up for a container or is this setting up an image for a container we already have, or is this just for a new container?
Oh, we have a hot mic. Let me mute it real quick.
Sure.
Okay. So we are currently this will make an image, and that image will eventually run a container that can run Python successfully. And that Python will run our Django API. Okay, perfect.
I have one more question.
Mhm.
For the pip, do I have to say pip3 or it just knows it's pip? We are asking about pip3.
No, it just knows. So just like we just do Python up here without doing Python 3, it's being defaulted to its default value will be pip. It already has some built-in aliases for us.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Okay, and actually, just to be sure, I know we technically don't really need this because this is the default value. Oh, actually, no, it's not. So we do need this. We need to specify where we want the server to run. So in our case, since we want to attach it to our local host, we need to specify that this will be running on 000 at port 8000 instead of 127.00.1, which is going to say 000 at port 8000. Okay, so now let's take a look at some Docker. Well, if I run Docker PS to see all of my running instances, you'll see that I don't have any. If I run Docker images, you'll see that I just have this Postgres image and this ambassador thing that I think just came with Docker. But you'll see that I have this Postgres image, and that's what I want to be able to utilize. And now the next thing that I need to do is I need to create an image for this Django API. Now, our command's going to look a little bit different because now that we've used this separate naming convention, I can't just tell Docker to run and find the Docker file inside of this directory. I need to actually specify which file inside of this directory I needed to run. So now I'm going to say Docker build. I'm going to give it a tag name, and that tag is just going to be Django Image. Well, we named the other one Postgres. Maybe this one could just be named Django. And then I'm just going to do this -f. So this -f is telling it, hey, this is not just a default image. I'm going to tell you how to find this image, or how to identify this image. So in this case, I'm going to tell it inside of this directory, I want you to use Dockerfile.api. And then I can say, well, use this as my starting reference point. So this current place inside of my, so Docker lessons, which is my root directory, I want you to start here as my reference point. And then I want you to find Dockerfile API to be able to build this image and give it a tag of Django. Does anyone have any questions over this command? Okay, so let's check it out. Let's see what happens when we run this. So we'll see it starts building. We can see that it's updating our get, and it seems like we got a problem here. So it tells me, all right, well, I tried running this, but for some reason it did not complete successfully. Exit code 100, so maybe I misspelled something. Let me make sure here. Interesting. Let me try to separate these two commands to make sure I know which one actually got the problem. And I'm just going to copy and paste what I have inside of the lecture because that's what I used yesterday. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any differences. But let's check this out. I'm going to attempt to build the image again. Oh, my syntax error here. Okay, so update was able to complete. There you go. So I must have done some syntactical error somewhere here. Okay, so now it's able to install my pip. Upgrade my pip. And after it upgraded my pip, it was able to install requirements.txt. We can see each individual job correlating with a number here, right? So each run command or each command runs separately. It was able to copy my entire directory. And then here it has, okay, well, we have migrate. And notice that at no point did it show the command Python manage py run server, right? It doesn't show that. It just says, okay, well, I stopped at the last command that you gave me, which was run. Okay, nice. So now I have that going, and that's great. Well, let's actually run our Django server now. So let's say I run Docker images. We'll be able to see Django as an image. The tag is latest. Here's my image ID, when was it created, and the size. Okay. So now we have this information. Well, how do I run this Docker image? Can anybody walk me through that command? We went over it yesterday. So what would that look like when I go ahead and run this command? Today, so far we've built a Docker image, and now the next part is running this image.
Yeah, you can say like Docker run and bind with the port 8000. Are we using 8000, I guess?
Yeah, let's bind it with the ports 8000. So I want to bind it on port 8000 on my machine.
8000 to,
Okay, perfect.
and you can name it, like take it like as, I don't know what kind of framework is it, API maybe?
Nice. Okay. And then the name of the image, right? So
Yeah.
okay.
If you want, you can delete it after killing that, after you stop that.
Yeah, we could definitely add that portion as well. So let's say --rm so that it's deleted as soon as I stop it. Okay, so let me run this so far. Okay, now it says watching for file changes with state loader. But it's not giving me back my terminal. Maybe I forgot to do something here.
Yeah, daemon, -daemon.
Nice, so -daemon mode. So let me control C real quick. Let me run Docker PS to see my running images. Okay, I don't currently have any. So I'm just gonna add -D so that it's running in daemon mode. Nice.
What happened to your Postgres image?
I stopped it.
Oh, okay.
The image is still here. I just don't have the container running.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So now when I do Docker PS, I can see in my container ID, my image is the Django image that I just currently built. Here's the command that was executed upon run, Python manage py run server, and then it did it to this server. It happened 4 seconds ago. It's been up for 3 seconds. And here it tells me that it's been binded. Well, let's make sure it has been binded. Let's bring over this browser window. And let's go to localhost 8000. Well, look at that. We have a Django server that's running. Django's actually working. The migrations were made. But it's not occupying any space inside of my computer, right? I'm not actually typing Python manage py run server and occupying my terminal. This is all happening in daemon mode within Docker. All right, we covered quite a bit of ground. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we've done so far?
Do we use Python manage run server, or it's gonna be G-Unicorn? I mean, how it works? Is it G-Unicorn?
Yeah, eventually we could utilize G-Unicorn once we're starting to work into development process, or once we start thinking about how we want to see things, right? But at the time right now, we're just going to be utilizing the Python server. We're trying to take chunks at a time.
Which one is usually better for production? Is it G-Unicorn, I guess?
I think it depends on your perspective, right? I would recommend that everybody utilizes G-Unicorn and then Nginx just so that you can see exactly how it will work once it goes into production, right? Instead of utilizing the default servers that they provide for you. But that's more of a preference thing than anything. Does that answer your question, Islam John?
Thank you.
Of course.
Just I got a quick question. In the beginning, when we were setting the environments, you had 2 lines in the README. Python don't write by bytecode and Python unbuffered. I didn't see that being entered in this Docker file.
Yes, that's correct. So those 2 lines in the README, if you look at the description, they're actually just to prevent Python from writing extra files that we don't need, right? So you could pass them, but they're more optional arguments than anything. They're not a necessity. I just have a couple of files that were automatically created by Python that now live inside of my container that I don't necessarily want. So I could add those 2 arguments later on to make that smaller. Currently, if I run Docker images, we can see that it's occupying 1.13 gigabytes, right? Well, but when I add those commands, I would expect this to get a little smaller, hopefully small enough to where I can actually see the size difference. But likely it's not going to be that much of a difference to, well, I'll be able to see it. But it'll just make a small size difference. Does that answer your question, Ivan?
Yes, thank you very much.
Of course. Okay. So now we're able to run a container with Django. And then yesterday we had a container running with Postgres. Well, let's run our Postgres container one more time. So I'm going to go ahead and say Docker run. That port is going to be, I'm going to run it in daemon mode. I'm going to tie it to port 5433 on my local machine. And the port that's exposed is 5432. It should be removed once I'm done. And I'm going to give it the name of database, just DB. Okay, and I know that the image I want to run is named Postgres. So now I have Docker PS. Okay, so currently I have a DB and I have an API container running. Well, now I want to tie those to each other. I want to make sure that Django is able to make a connection and dump my data inside of that database that I created yesterday. Well, I'm basically going to create a link between these 2 different networks because remember, Docker essentially has its own network system. So these names that we've provided are going to work as DNS names, as domain name systems, right? So when I go to build out my Docker, when I go to change a little bit of information in my settings.py to tell my database settings where to find my database, I'm going to specify the host being DB because that would be like the same thing as db.com, but it's just happening within the Docker network. All right. So let's take a look at how that works. And we're actually going to comment out this portion where we're running our migration because it's currently not connected to Postgres. So I'm going to go over to the Django API, come over to settings, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to my database settings. Let's open up this Docker image so that we can visualize it as well. No longer going to need that. All right. So here in settings.py, I want this database to essentially share the same information as the database that I'm creating through Postgres. So in the engine, what would be the first thing I need to change?
PSQLite to PSQL. Oh, Postgres.
So let's change that to PostgreSQL. What would be the name of this database?
DB.
Almost. But if we look here on line 8, we gave it the name container to do. Right, so I can say, all right, well, the name's going to be container to do DB. Okay. But now we also have a couple of other arguments like username and password. So let's add that in there. Let's have our username, or actually this should just be user. I apologize. So who would the user be in this case?
You.
Yeah, so Francisco Avila. What would be the password?
Password. All lowercase.
And now finally we can say host, and we can specify the port. All right, so which port is exposed? Here,
432.
yeah, so 5432. And then it comes to the host portion. Well, remember, we just went over how Docker actually works and as far as creating its own internal network, right? So what would be the host that's the net that Docker will identify this container by?
DB.
Perfect. So we're going to specify DB. Right, so this is now telling Django, hey Django, I want to utilize PostgreSQL. The name of the database that we're going to enter will be container _ to do _ DB. The user will be Francisco Avila. Here's the password that he utilizes. Here's the host of this database. So I want you to go to this DNS system and find DB. And then I want you to access this following port, 5432.
Are we using exposed port or the binding port? Because 5433 comes from outside.
So 5433 is the port that's attached to my machine to be able to enter the database, but the exposed port of this container is 5432.
Okay, so thanks.
Of course. All right. So now I'm just going to go ahead and stop this API. So I'm going to say Docker stop API. We can see it was terminated. So let's say Docker PS to take a look here. All right, we still only have Postgres running. I'm going to delete this image. So let me make sure that the images isn't there. So I'm going to say Docker images. So I still have Django, but I made a new change to my Django project. So I'm going to have to actually delete this image and then create a new one. So I'm going to go ahead and say Docker image RMI, and that's for removing an individual image. And I'm going to pass it the name. So in this case, it's Django. Okay, so now if I say Docker images, we can see the only image I have is Postgres. I believe I heard somebody speaking. Was there a question by any chance? Well, this may be a good natural stopping point. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Francisco, sorry, whenever you make changes like this, with Docker, do you always have to delete and then recreate an image? Like if you were to change your views in a Django file and then you have to drop and recreate your database, is it kind of that same way?
Essentially, you'll have to rebuild the image every time because remember the code that's living inside of this image is only the code that was copied at that time, right? So I could change the one on my local machine as much as I want, but the image won't reflect those changes. I'll have to copy it again to rebuild that image. Awesome. All right, so now let's actually build our Docker image one more time. But now when we build it, we're actually going to link it to Postgres. So this command is going to get a little hefty. So let's go ahead and follow the regular procedure that we have so far. So we're going to run this. Oh, I got to build the image first. I apologize. So Docker build the image that I want to build. I'm going to run dash. Oh, I got to give it a name first. So the tag name will be Django. The path, I want it to be inside of this directory, and it's named Dockerfile.api. And I want you to utilize this current directory that I'm on as your reference point, as your starting point. So let's build it. All right. So it builds. It's able to update apt-get. It's able to install the recommended things that I needed to set up my environment. I was able to copy requirements.txt. I was able to pip install my requirements and update pip, and I was able to copy my entire project. Okay, good. Well, now let's actually go into running this container now. So I'm going to say, all right, well, I want Docker to run this container in daemon mode. I wanted to attach it to port 8000 on my machine, to the port 8000 on the Docker container. I'm going to give it the name API. And this is the new part. Well, now I want it to have a link to a separate container. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to link it to the name of the container that I want to link it to, which is DB. And this is so the left side is the name of the container. The right side is how I want my Django container to be able to reference it. So it's kind of like a DB as, and then what is it that I want it to be known as? So in this case, I named it DB as well. All right. If I had it as like my Postgres API, this left side would say my Postgres API, and then I would want Django to reference it as DB. And then after that, I can just run Django because that's the image that I want it to run. So let's see what happens. Okay, I get back my code there, or my little ID. If I run Docker PS, we can see that Django is attached to my Python. Okay, so that's all great and all. But currently we haven't made any actual migrations, right? All of my migrations haven't been applied. Although I'm running the server, there's no migrations being applied. So let's actually apply those migrations. And now we can actually go into how we would enter each one of these containers. So Docker allows you to enter the container by saying Docker EX. This command stands for execute. So it's exec. I can pass it into it. And this is saying, this is the portion that I want you to go into. I can say API because that's the name of the container. And then I can give it a command. So I could either just do the command here where I say Python manage py, make migrations, or I can enter bash. And now we'll see I'm inside of a root. It gives me the code of that container. So 40592. Here we see it, 40592. And it gives me a little hash. Well, that's because I'm actually within the container as the root user. And now I can run regular commands. I can run ls here. I can see all the different files that I have. Right. And then I can also say, well, I want you to Python manage py, migrate. Okay. So now I migrated. And when I migrated, we can see all of these different migrations were applied. So in theory, they would actually be inside of Postgres now. So let's check Postgres. I'm going to go ahead and exit this container. And I'm going to enter Postgres the same way we did yesterday. All right. So I'm going to say Docker. Oh, I apologize. In this case, we'll utilize PSQL. So I'm going to enter to PSQL-H, which will be localhost at port 5433. And then the name of that DB, which is container underscore to do underscore DB. It's going to ask me for my password. And now if I run /d, we can see all of my Django migrations have been applied into my Postgres container. Okay.
I'm sorry to rehash from yesterday. That's the command that you enter the Postgres on your Docker image, right? That dash H and okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yes. So this is just to enter the database, not the container itself. I'm entering the database that's being hosted by the container, but I'm entering it through my own local machine. Does that make sense, Ivan?
Yes, but if you do like a /L, it tells you all of the databases that are on the Docker image, right?
It tells me all the databases that are inside of this database. Yes, correct. And this database lives inside of that Docker container. Kind of how Django lives inside of the Django container, but my browser can still render Django. That's essentially the same thing. I can still enter the database. I'm not inside of the container. I'm just accessing information that's inside of that container.
Got it. Thank you.
And this is actually all we have for today. So at this point, this is the perfect part for questions. So if anyone has any questions they would like to ask, how we're actually able to link to each other, how we went about building our Postgres image, this would be the perfect time to talk about it.
It seems pretty straightforward. Like, the loading of the Docker image. I am just like anxious to see what that looks like when we're deploying, right? And how do we deploy differently with Docker versus how we did before? So that's just a comment, no question. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, no problem. Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about Docker, right? Is that it's so straightforward and easy to use. So that's one of the biggest pros of Docker. If I ever wanted to share this information with anyone in the class, I could easily just send you guys these Docker images, or I can send you the actual Docker repository. We haven't covered that portion yet, but we'll go into how to build Docker repositories. And that's actually how deployment will happen. We'll build a container, we'll push that container up to Docker Hub. And then once we go into our EC2 instance, we just pull that container down and run that container inside of that EC2 instance. And that's it for deployment. We won't actually have to go in there and manually change anything with Nginx. Docker will take care of all of it and host our entire project inside of our EC2 instance.
Yeah, saw behind the curtain. Thank you.
Do we do the same thing with the front end also? Just separate Docker container for that front end?
Yes, we will be working on the front end tomorrow. And then, not tomorrow, I apologize, on Monday. And then Tuesday, we'll be going over Docker Compose, which is essentially running all 3 separate containers inside of one Dockerfile. And then Wednesday, we'll be covering deployment with Docker. Does that answer your question, Islam John?
Yep. Great, thank you.
Perfect. All right, let me go ahead and stop this recording.